So now for our speaker, Dr. Richard Vedder earned his BA in economics at Northwestern University and his PhD in economics at the University of Illinois. He is currently a distinguished professor of economics and a faculty associate at the Contemporary History Institute at Ohio University. He is also a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, director of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity in Washington, D.C., and has served as an economist with Congress's Joint Economic Committee. He has published numerous articles and books on various economic topics, including unemployment, the national debt, American economic history, education, immigration, Walmart, and notably for our talk today, his book, Going Broke by Degree, Why College Costs Too Much. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Vedder.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here to speak to this audience. As I was telling my seatmate next to me a little while ago, my wife is from Cleveland, and I've had a long and many happy memories being in the city, and I love the area around University Circle, so it was great coming up here today. The issue is, why does college cost too much? I guess you could argue, does it cost too much? But the topic that was more or less assigned me was, why have college costs risen so much? Maybe we should put it that way. And let's start out. This will be very simple. I don't have any PowerPoint. Frankly, what case wasn't paying me very much money, so I didn't do a PowerPoint. So I'll use what I call West Virginia PowerPoint, which is I use my hands and go up and down, sort of low technology PowerPoint, and suggest to you that the cost of going to college has risen at roughly double the rate of inflation over the last 40, 50 years. If the rate of inflation in a given year, in fact, last year, the last 12 months, the official rate of inflation has been 1.7%, but most tuition fees have gone up 4 or 5%, 2-3 percentage points more than the inflation rate. The university that I teach at now is sort of a typical state university, Ohio University in Athens. I started teaching there back in the dark ages, 1965, 47 years ago. I'm in my 48th year of teaching, by the way. The tuition was $450, and I managed, that's not semester tuition, that's annual tuition. So I spent the better part of 10 minutes this morning doing some calculations as to what that is in today's dollars. It's $3,291. The actual tuition is $10,216, which most people think is pretty a bargain. I'm at my Case Western Reserve standards. But still, that's more than a tripling, and so I did the calculation, what is the compounded annual rate of increase beyond the inflation rate? It was 2.45%. So then I said, well, let me take my undergraduate, take a different type of school, one more kind of probably closer to Case. Let's take the school I went to as an undergraduate, which was Northwestern University, a private urban university. And the tuition when I entered Northwestern was $795 a year, $265 a quarter. Today it is $43,380. And so that's more than a 50-fold nominal increase. But allowing for inflation and so forth, I calculated the annual rate of increase in tuition, adjusting already for inflation, is 3.63%. So one school about 2.5% roughly, the other about 3.5% roughly. So when people say, how much has college costs gone up? If you look at sticker prices, they've gone up more or less 3% a year the last 30, 40, 50 years. A lot depending on exactly what dating you use, what type of institutions you're looking at. Now, my friends in the educational establishment, and I do have a few left, I was put, by the way, by the president on a commission a few years ago to investigate higher education in America called the Spellings Commission. And I was always the dissenter on the commission. My highest compliment was when the Journalists refer to me as the Simon Cowell of the Spellings Commission. And so I have been, sort of ranting and raving about higher education for a long time. And all my distinguished colleagues will say, yes, but net tuition isn't going up as much because we're giving so many more scholarships these days. That is, we're discounting the price for some students relative to others. There's some truth to that. But however you slice it, the price of college is going up relative to other things. Now, I want to keep this short. One of the gentlemen here indicated he had to be out of here by 7:30, and I want him to hear every word of my remarks. I wouldn't want him to miss any of this. So I'm going to speak very fast. I do have to tell one story here, which is a story that shows you how professors can manipulate the politicians and so forth who help fund higher ed. The state of Ohio was indignant over the very low teaching loads of professors at state universities in the mid-90s, and they passed a bill that ultimately read, the teaching load of people at higher education institutions, public higher education institutions in Ohio, the teaching load shall rise 10%. 10%. 10% of what? So our university formed a committee, not a committee, actually about 10 committees, one for each college, every unit. Each department had a subcommittee, and so probably 50 committees, probably 300 people, looking into the issue, what is meant by this? And of course they couldn't conclude. One person said, well, if your syllabus has 10 reading items, now it has to have 11. If you've assigned 50 pages of reading, now you've got to assign 55. If your multiple choice questions are 50 questions, now they have to be 55, and so on. Well, of course, we did absolutely nothing. We ignored the law. Unfortunately, I'm the hapless individual who was the first person to testify before the legislature after the law took effect, and I was talking to the legislature on pharmaceutical drug pricing or some obscure issue. And the chair of the committee said to me, Professor Vedder, before you begin your testimony, I want you to tell us how you're meeting the new mandate to teach 10% more. Boy, I'm in the spot. I'm representing all state universities in Ohio. I'm the first person to speak on this subject before the legislature. I had no guidance what the party line was on this. So I simply said, Senator, I just talked 10% faster in class than I used to. She had term limits, I had tenure, she's gone, I still teach. And that actually points out some of the issues relating to the difficulties with changing higher education. We more or less do what we want. Anyway, okay, here's two theories as to why costs have gone up a lot. I realize we have a limited amount of time, so let me get to it. A theory that is popular with university presidents, with the head of, say, the American Council of Education and all of the, should we say, higher education establishment, goes something like this. It's named after, a very well-known economist at Princeton named William Baumol, a very good economist, who kind of argues, well, teaching's like theater. Teaching's like theater. Professors are actors. There's some truth to this. I mean, I first admit there's some truth to this. And if you look at King Lear, which was written, well, Shakespeare died in 1615, so somewhere before that, 400 years ago roughly, King Lear was written. It takes the same number of actors to put on King Lear today as it did when Shakespeare wrote it a number of years ago. Indeed, I think it takes more because in those days they would use men to play the women's roles, and they don't do that anymore. So a guy could play two roles, and today that's considered not authentic. So we actually use more actors today to play King Lear. So there is no productivity increases possible in higher ed because we're doing an innately, a service which is innately immune to productivity changes. There's no way to improve on that. So therefore, costs are going to rise high because in other parts of the economy where productivity advances are huge, and wages therefore go up. Well, we have to pay our professors what we pay other professions, so we have to keep raising their pay even though they're doing the same amount of work as they were 40, 50, 100, 200, 400 years ago, or 2,400 years ago when Socrates taught the youth of Athens. So I once argued that with the possible exception of prostitution, there has been no profession that has had zero productivity increase since Socrates taught the youth of Athens. So here we are, that's the Baumol argument. We can't increase productivity in higher ed, so the costs are inherently rising, and live with it. But is that really so? Is it true? What do most universities spend their money on? First of all, do they spend most of their money on teaching? No. They spend 30% of their money, 25% of the money on teaching faculty. They spend a lot of money on associate deans of this and assistant deans of that, and student affairs people, diversity coordinators, recycling. My favorite today is sustain. I don't even know what sustainability is. Yeah, my university's got all kinds of sustainability people and green initiatives and all this crap going on. It has nothing to do with what I do in the classroom. It's kind of an interference in a way with what I do in the classroom. So what do? My university had 2 associate provosts in 1994. We now have 10. We have a Secretary of State now. We didn't used to have a Secretary of State. We are at least having open embassies in other countries. Yeah, but we're getting there. We're getting there. We have overseas branches. I guess that's kind of like embassies. So, and I'm sure the same thing is true to some extent at Case. I don't want to speak. Oh, I see several nods in the audience, so, which is what I always get when faculty are present. So this notion that we can't prove productivity in higher ed is, I think, dubious. And then there's little things like the computer, online education, and so forth, which I think have had some important advances. To be sure, there are some limitations of these techniques, but they certainly have had important advances. And to argue that technology cannot be used in higher education, I think is simply false. So then there's another argument of a altogether different kind. It goes sort of like this. We have an academic arms race going on in higher education. And the way a university president keeps her job, or his job, is, first of all, she raises a ton of money, and, well, the ethics of how this is done are less important than getting the money. And you get the money by saying we're going to bring economic development to the community, or we're going to provide equal opportunity to our students, and we're going to keep tuition increases low, we're going to help low-income students come here. You do what it takes to get the bucks. And then you get the bucks. And then what do you do when you get the bucks? You appease the constituencies that could endanger your job, or could make life miserable for you, and who wouldn't speak to you at parties and so forth, and just be unpleasant. So you don't want that to happen. So you go out and you bribe people. You bribe the faculty. The faculty are eminently bribable. I know, I've been one for years. I've been ripping off taxpayers for 47 years. You offer them low teaching loads, they love that. You offer them relatively high pay, not outrageously high pay, but decently high pay. And you give them good parking, preferably at low cost. For the students, it's pretty easy. You make it the academic rigor of the programs modest so that they don't have to work too hard. And frankly, you kind of turn your head the other way when they just have sex and drink all night, and kind of encourages co-ed dorms and all these things, shower with a friend, whatever. So for the alumni, you give them nice buildings. In some schools, and this would not hold at Case so much, you give them good athletic teams. So for down the road at Ohio State, all you have to do is have a good football and good basketball coaching. Get away. Gordon Gee gets away with absolute murder at Ohio State. He just paid, by the way, put in a new shower curtain in the president's house and alert a reporter found out he paid $579 for it. So, I mean, this is, you know, the kind of thing. $2,700 for a duvet. I didn't even know what a duvet was. Can't you get one at Bed Bath & Beyond for $100? Anyway, so, and you give the administrators lots of assistants, assistant provosts, assistant deans, deanlets, whatever you call them. You pay them a lot, you give them parking too, and you give the board of trustees whatever they want, however harebrained or crazy it is, because they kind of hire you. And all of this happens, and it's partially financed by federal student loan and grant programs that were not designed to have that impact, but in fact have. The federal government gives kids a lot of money, doesn't give them, a lot of it's lent, some of it's given, to go to school. They borrow more, they think, oh, this is a good investment. So they're less sensitive to price than they otherwise would be. Universities are able to jack up their tuition a little more than they otherwise would be. They raise a little more money, and that helps finance the academics arms race. It's not entirely that factor, but that's one factor that contributes to this. So these are a few of the things going on. Now let me move on, and I didn't ask, because this is a group of sort of libertarian people, they're sort of prone to disorganization. So I didn't ask them how long I had to speak. I guess I did, you know. Professors, you know, operate on essentially no resource constraints whatsoever. But I do know time is a resource of constraint, and one of our distinguished guests has to be at his lab by 7:30 because his experiment's going to blow up if he isn't there by then. So I will speak a little faster than I have. I'm sorry. Let me, just for the sake of argument, argue that there are 12, here's the West Virginia, 12 key expressions that can be used to explain rising costs in higher education. They're not the only 12. I can think of others, but I wanted to keep, I started out with 10, thinking 10 commandments and all that. I said, well, we could go to 12. And so that's what they are. So let me give you 12 expressions that I think go a long way to explain some of the rising costs. One of the expressions is third-party payments. And given the marvelous medical facilities near here, this is often raised, invoked with respect to medical care and healthcare issues. When someone else pays the bills, or at least part of the bills, the customer, and for that matter, the producer, become far less sensitive about costs. They don't have to worry about it. Someone else is paying the bills, so you become less sensitive, and that allows you to get away with spending more money, doing more uneconomic things than you can, because you're not paying the bill, someone else. And the third party here is mostly the U.S., is part the U.S. government, partly state government, but it's partly private philanthropy too. You have a significant endowment here, and it can be private. Although I might add, with the private endowments, a large part of the private endowments are aided and abetted by favorable tax policies, which are designed, which allow people to get tax deductions and so forth. Case, for example, on endowments, they still do have an endowment here, I understand. The endowment, actually fairly substantial endowment, the endowment here earns income from capital gains on the sale of securities. Those would be taxed if you were an ordinary citizen at 15%, starting January 1. Who knows? We don't know who's going to be elected. Maybe at 122% if Mr. Obama gets elected. I don't know. We take all your money and then make you sign a note saying you'll work for us for the rest of your life for added money, or you'll be put in a room with Nancy Pelosi for a week. I shouldn't have said that. Strike that from the record. Lawyer, is there any lawyers here? Yes, we have a strike that from the record. Irrelevant immaterial. Irreverent and immaterial. Okay, so third-party payments is one factor I mentioned. Let me go on, because otherwise I won't get done. A second feature of higher education is it's non-profit in nature. 90% of it is. That means there are relatively few incentives to be efficient. Where a for-profit enterprise exists, their success depends on reducing costs to a minimum and also increasing revenues, usually by producing a better product. So there's a lot of pressure to improve the quality of the product or introduce new, better products, and or to lower costs. Those pressures are much less intense in higher education. Therefore, the for-profit higher education sector is a particularly interesting new development in higher ed. And there are some problems with it. It's largely government financed indirectly, but nonetheless, they do some things differently. And it's kind of interesting to study the two types of institutions as to how they behave. We can talk more about that if we have time. I want to get through the basic points first. My third expression is bottom line, ties in with the second one. Did Case have a good year in 2011? Who the hell would know? What's the bottom line at Case? How do you measure success? What is the product of Case? Well, first of all, we can argue what is the product of Case, but even if we agree what the product is, that is what the kinds of things you're doing, are you doing it well? Are you doing it better than, say, comparable other universities? Better than Carnegie Mellon, for example, in Pittsburgh? Or better than my alma mater, Northwestern, or the University of Chicago, in Chicago? Are you doing a better job? Are you doing it well? How do we know? What's the bottom line? What is the bottom line? Corporations have bottom lines. I wanted to know what the price of a common stock of a company was right up here. I looked it up. It was $23.17, and it had been $23.08 yesterday. The bottom line improved overnight. Or another bottom line is profits itself. Is the company making money or losing money? Is it making more or less? Is Case doing well? Well, you know, we have endowment statistics, we have graduation rate statistics. We do have some measures of metrics, as they say, about how Case is doing. But we don't have a consensus of what the bottom line is. How can you do well at something when you don't even know what it is you're trying to do? That sounds fairly elementary to me. Then there's a fourth point. I'll call it resource rigidities. There's a lot of fixed costs in higher ed, things that can't be moved, can't be changed. The one that most people like to pick on the most is tenure, the faculty lifetime employment contracts. And there's some truth to that tenure does make it difficult to change. If you have hired a bunch of anthropologists in a stage of progressive enthusiasm back in the 60s, and they're all retiring today and going off to smoke pot wherever they smoke pot in their little dotage. And you would decide, we don't need as many anthropologists as we used to. We need to hire biochemists, or we need to hire computer engineers. There's a computer engineer here somewhere. There he is. We need to hire more computer engineers. We need to reallocate resources within the university to computer engineering away from anthropology. It's a little difficult to do because of the institution of tenure. But another example of research rigidities is we spend preposterously large amounts on capital resources. We have an edifice complex at university. We love big buildings, nice buildings, gorgeous buildings. Some of this today is to feed the academic arms race. You got to have a climbing wall. No university is worth a damn if it doesn't have a climbing wall. You got to have all of the, country clubization dimensions of universities. Cases, city bounds, you probably don't have a golf course. This is a horrible state of affairs. But in addition to that, the regular buildings, the academic buildings, how often are they used? Are they used 12 months a year? Are they used 11 months a year? Yes, they're used nominally 12 months a year. But if you go in June, July, and August to a classroom, in any campus in the United States. Will you likely see it occupied, even 9 to 5? No. If you go in on Saturday and Sunday, will you see it occupied? No. If you go in even on Fridays, will you see it occupied? No. So we use classrooms 20 hours a week, 30 hours a week. If the private sector tried to operate that way, they'd be out of business overnight. Well, not overnight, within a year. Well, probably not if they get a bailout from the administration. They might last 3 or 4 years. But, you know, even Solyndra couldn't exist under this basis. So, so this is a problem. We have resources that are fixed. And then there's who owns the building? We'll come back to that in a minute. Sometimes the chemistry, well, I'll come back, I'll pick on that. Let me get through these points. I'm running too late. I'm taking too long on this. I'm sorry. I hope you don't send me away early. Actually, she owes me a few bucks, and I want to get through the rest of this lecture without totally annoying Victoria. Point 5, barriers to entry in higher education are surprisingly high, and barrier and constraints on competition are high. For example, we have something called accreditation, something I never fully understood, because I've never known a major university in the United States to ever lose its accreditation because it was bad. In other words, quality control is really pretty nickel-dime in these places. They do relatively little, but they have a lot of influence, and they stop new startups from going into business. New, for example, for-profit companies want to enter. They can't get accreditation in this part of the country at the general level. It's something called the Higher Learning Commission of the North Central Association of Schools. They can't get accreditation. So they don't. A couple years ago, there's a school in Nebraska, been operating 100 years, a Lutheran school. It was called Dana College. Working fine. No problems with the academic programs. The kids were doing well. But the school was having financial difficulties, so they decided to sell it to a private operator, a for-profit operator. And the for-profit operator pledged to keep the campus as is, although they would expand online programs as well. They lost their accreditation because the accreditor didn't like the fact that it was a for-profit company. No quality issue involved at all. This is the kind of nonsense is the wrong word, I should be objective. This is a kind of phenomena that is occurring in higher ed, and it means when you have barriers to entry, you tend to get high prices, more of a monopoly influence, and so on. A 6th point is public support and control of higher ed. All of higher ed in the United States, with a few minor exceptions, Hillsdale College is probably the best example, is really under the thumb of government to a considerable extent. And I would include Case. I did a study recently on how much money does Princeton University get from public taxpayer support, and how much money does the College of New Jersey, previously Trenton State University, located 12 miles away, get. Princeton gets 30 times, 25 times as much money per capita as Trenton State. Most of it from the feds, a lot of it research grants, federal research grants. A lot of it is justifiable money. I'm not complaining about it. But all the tax breaks and the special tax breaks help the Princetons more than they do the colleges of New Jersey. So that even a school like Case is dependent in part on federal support, and this somehow can lead to some constraints. There's rules and so forth. Many of you in the scientific community know, I don't know how onerous it is. Institutional review board rules and so forth are examples, aside from the affirmative action and other type rules. At the public school level, the public universities also face things like the governor appoints the board of trustees. That's not always a cool idea. The terms are limited. The University of Michigan is mightily fighting all the time to increase its out-of-state enrollment beyond 35, 36%, even though they would do well to take 40, 50% from the pure academic standpoint, and even from a revenue point of view. But they're not allowed to because of political consideration. So these political obstacles are sometimes great. A 7th term, price discrimination. We treat different students differently. If you're rich, you pay more than if you're poor. If you have a preferred other quality about you, you pay more or less, depending whether, if you have a preferred quality, you pay less. That is, if your skin color is the right color, or if your gender is the right gender, or if you're, even at some schools now, your sexual orientation is correct, which is to say non-heterosexual. My university's come up with a new term. They've done away with heterosexual. They think it's too sexist. They've come up with cisgender or something. I don't even understand the word. This is what the people in the Nazis in the Office of Resident Life are trying to do. So, you hadn't heard that one? No, you're just not with it, you know. Price discrimination. Now, price discrimination isn't always bad. Economists love price discrimination. Airlines price discriminate. It's good. Half the time the airplanes would be empty. If you charge everyone $400, the airplanes would be empty. So you get the people who pay $400, they pay $400, and then you find another group of people who are tourists and all, who you won't get unless you charge them less and give them a $250 rate, and you fill the plane up more than you otherwise would. That's more efficient, and more revenue for the airlines, they'll have ultimately lower fares, blah, blah, blah. So price discrimination isn't all bad, but it does help increase the sticker price of colleges, and it scares some people away. A lot of low-income people are scared away from colleges just by the sticker price, even though in some cases they get a substantial reduction from that sticker price in the form of Pell Grants, federal student loans, and institutional support. Okay, an 8th point, rent seeking. This is a term economists use. If you pay someone more than you have to pay them to get the job done, you're paying them economic rent. You're making a payment that has no economic payoff, no economic result, effect. And so if you pay a university president $1 million a year, when she would work for $600,000 a year, that extra $400,000 is not providing the university with any benefit whatsoever, but it is a cost that is a transfer of income from one group of people, in some cases student tuition payers, to another group, another person, in this case the university president. Now, salaries in higher education are not really, when you look at the high education attainment and so forth, are not really all that out of line with other professions. Some cases they're lower, some cases they're higher. But there are increasing numbers of examples of truly extraordinary payments way beyond what would have happened a dozen years ago. The president of Yale is a man named Henry Levin, I think, is the president of Yale. And I think when he was hired in 2000, he made $375,000 or $400,000 a year. I think he makes $1.5 million a year now. Same guy, same position. He's 12 years old, probably a little more senile, probably works a little less each day. And he's making 3.5 times as much. You know, maybe that is excessive. You know, at least one can make that argument. A 9th point, cross-subsidization. Some students at universities are very, very expensive to educate, and yet they pay less in some cases than other students who are very cheap to educate. And so universities reallocate, or take resources and move it to programs that they want to do. And this, in the case of most research universities, means undergraduates are treated less extravagantly and less well, and they get less subsidy from the state or from endowment monies and all than graduate students who get the lion's share of this money. So because faculty like to teach graduate students and like to do research, and most of them, not all of them, but a lot of them find undergraduate students a pain in the butt. So they, we charge the grad tuition rate is the same as undergraduates. That most graduate students get waivers or grants or fellowships or assistantships and so forth. Undergraduates are less likely to do so. The average graduate student actually pays less than the average undergraduate, but the cost of educating a graduate student is always much more. So there's this kind of subsidization going on higher ed. We could find other examples. The 10th point, ownership. Who owns the university? Who owns Case Western Reserve? I suspect there's a charter that says the Board of Trustees is the formal legal owner of Case Western Reserve University. Do they even know what's going on? I had a trustee of your university call me up and said, I can't get this information out of so-and-so, and I won't name names. Do you know anything about this? Now, you know, I don't not making it passing. I think this would be true in any university. But who owns case? Is it the board of trustees? They're legal owners, but they're a part-time, non-salaried people who have limited knowledge of what's going on. Do the faculty own the university? They are the heart and soul of the university. They do the teaching, they do the research. Often they think they own the university. And do the administrators own the university? They think they own the university. They say the trustees are just troublesome people who come in every 3 months. We give them a lot of good wine and food and make them happy and show them, give them a nice PowerPoint, show what all the good things we're doing, and they go away happy. Do they think they own the university? Some schools, the students, what nerve they have, think they own the university. They're getting awfully uppity. They think they own the university. Who owns the university? It's murky. And when ownership is unclear, sometimes decision-making is unclear, and that brings me to point 11, governance. Who governs the university? Who runs the universities? Well, they're run crazily. At some schools, there is a strong president who really makes a lot of decisions. And in other schools, the term shared governance is believed with a vengeance, and you can't do anything without the approval of the major power players. The faculty, the senior administrators, in some cases prominent alumni and donors. And so decision-making is sort of a compromise. It's made by committee. We make decisions by committee. Often instead of taking bold steps, we take timid steps in order to appease powerful interest groups on campus. So where governance is murky, you have murky results, and you get sometimes really weird things, interesting things happen, such as at the University of Virginia this summer, where the board got together and said, we don't think she's doing such a hot job, let's fire her. And they did, and everyone on campus professed to love the president. A war ensued openly in the newspapers and everywhere else, where everyone, so the University of Virginia, as we know it, is about ready to end. Thomas Jefferson just rolled over in his grave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A week later, the board of trustees put the president back in. Now, isn't that a wonderful position to be a president of an institution whose board had fired her and then rehired her? If that isn't probation, I don't know what is. And so you get these murky situations. You get them less likely where you have clearly defined ownership rights, like through shares of stock and so forth in private corporations. The 12th point and last point. And the most important, the one I should have mentioned first, information. You can't achieve goals, first of all, if you don't know, we don't have a bottom line, but you can't achieve goals if you don't know anything about what's happening. What are the outcomes in case? Do the seniors know more than the freshmen? Are there critical learning skills more enhanced? How do you know that they are? Do you have test results to show this? For places that are in the knowledge business that test and measure everything under the sun, and institutions that have had 35,000 academic papers written on William Shakespeare since 1985 alone. 1,000 a year, 3 a day, 1 every 8 hours. There's a new paper on Shakespeare. But do we know what our kids know? Hell no. Do we even know what they earn 10, 20 years after graduation? Do we know what the Case students earn relative to what the Carnegie Mellon students earn? No. There's lots of things we don't know. And some of them, even if we do know, there's something called the National Survey of Student Engagement, NSSE, given out by most of the public schools in the country. They ask questions like, how many hours a week do you spend in class studying or writing papers? How many hours do you work at academics? How many hours do you spend going to parties and recreating? So on and so forth. Do you like your professors? How many papers, 20 pages or long or longer, have you written in the last year? Questions like this. Kind of measuring the engagement of students in the academic enterprise. 750 schools administer this test. Hardly any of them publish the results. The reason, they don't want people to know. They don't want the competition to know. What if the people at Case work 28 hours a week and they work 32 hours a week at Carnegie Mellon? By the way, the average hours a week, according to U.S. Department of Labor data, for students studying in academic programs in the United States is 29 hours a week, 32 weeks a year. That's 900 hours a year. The parents work twice that. So, I'm not saying that's what you work at Case. I know you all are hard here. This is a nerdy school. Everyone works hard. You're better than that. You work 36 hours instead of 29, whatever. I don't know. But we don't know. We just don't know. Now, let me conclude this. I've already gone way beyond my thing, and my rate of return on, the gentleman's already leaving. I don't blame him. I would have left long.
His experiment.
Yeah, his experiment. We don't want human knowledge to... yeah, thank you. Yeah. No, I had a nice chat with him beforehand. He knows everything I'm going to say anyway. Let me end with a suggestion that if I were forced to use 3 words, all beginning with one letter, the same letter, to describe the way that higher education reform needs to proceed in America, I would use the letter I, and the 3 words would be information, incentives, and innovation. And American universities, and all universities, lack vital information. You can't achieve goals, you can't be efficient if you don't measure what you're doing, your outcomes, and even some of your inputs, your costs. You can't succeed if you don't have incentives to push people in the direction to achieve what you're trying to achieve. For example, lower costs. Professors have no desire to cut costs. I teach exactly the same way. I'm teaching a course in American economic history, which this dude here in the second row, where we go to public school, we call him dude. So this student in the second row, I'm teaching exactly the same way I did 47 years ago. Not a bit change. I don't even use PowerPoint. I send them emails every now and then. But why don't I do things different? Why don't I take advantage of new technology? Why? I like the way of doing things. I like it. Why should I do things different? There's no incentives to. Innovation. I think innovation will kind of happen if we have incentives, we have information. The American free enterprise system is enormously innovative. We've invented more crazy, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things. What Google did, what et cetera, all the social media, all that stuff could be applied to higher ed, and it is starting to be. By the way, there is an open source movement of there's some interesting developments going on, but they are kind of too little too late, as it were. And if the incentives were in place and if information in place, I think we'd have a lot of entrepreneurs pushing for greater innovation. Well, these are a few thoughts on this topic, and I hope you found this of interest. So I appreciate your inviting me very much, Victoria. Thank you, and thank you very much. If anyone has a question or two, I'd be more than happy to try to answer. Yes?
So when you say that, more small businesses or startups would happen, would that be combat with systems like the patent system and the copyright system? Because those both make it very hard right now for people to,
Yeah, I'm not an expert on patents, but patents are a two-edged sword, is what you're suggesting. On the one hand, they are an incentive system. Patents provide enormous incentives for people to invent and to innovate. But on the other hand, in the extreme, they can be a barrier to competition, a barrier to greater production, lower prices, whatever. So that's an area where there's a trade-off between incentives on the one hand, it seems to me, and a free openness to competition on the other. Higher ed, there's been some suggestion that if professors shared more in the fruits of the research that they produce that has commercial payoffs, that there would be more of it. And there has been some move in modern years in that direction, and there have been consequently some significant increase in commercialization of research. How though you evaluate the productivity and contribution of an English professor, and which is dealing with ideas, or a philosophy professor in the humanities and the social sciences, and how you reward that is not an easy question, but the point is we don't work terribly hard at trying to find out that in higher ed. We don't do much to that, and we don't incentivize people. You know, you've heard it said before, teaching at most truly research-oriented universities is downplayed considerably. The money for an assistant professor is not made talking patiently with undergraduate students. It's made spending time in the lab or in the library or whatever. No one goes to the library anymore. You have a library? Yeah, I think I saw one next door. In the library. Most libraries are looking more like Barnes and Nobles these days, or sort of Starbucks-ish kind of places, lots of coffee shops and computers lying around. And occasionally you'll find a book on a shelf for old-timers like me. But any other questions? I didn't really answer your question. Yes?
I've heard a lot of, when talking about this topic, people, complaining about the higher cost, especially regarding subsidies from, various government entities. And the argument that that's okay is that now more people, more minorities, more lower income people have access to the higher education.
Oh! Thank you. Let's talk empirical evidence. What percent of recent college graduates in 1970, before we had Pell Grants, before we had a big student loan program, what percent were from the bottom 1/4 of the income distribution? Answer, 12%. Now, there are 25% of the people are in the bottom quartile, so the fact that only 12 were recent graduates means that poor people were underrepresented in that group. What is the percentage today? $100 billion in annual student loans, $30–40 billion in Pell Grants later. What percentage of the recent college graduates of the United States of America come from the bottom quartile of the income distribution? 7.2%. Less. What has happened as the government has dropped money out of airplanes, first over student houses and then over university campuses, or the equivalent. It's not done quite that way. That'd be a little more efficient way of doing it, by the way. You cut administrative costs down quite a bit, except the big guys would beat up the little guys to get the money. There's a little bit of an equity problem. But as we've dropped money out of airplanes over college campuses and student homes, universities, aware of this, have raised their prices. And they've raised them a good bit. So the little school I went to called Northwestern University, that in 1958 when I attended school was $795 a year, and people who were, say, skilled machinists, union members, but from lower first generation college students could afford to send their kids there, or even poorer kids. Today is $43,380, and a lot of people just see that figure and they don't even apply. They don't even apply. Now, another problem that's happened, to the extent we have pushed some people to apply who come from extremely low income families and come from extremely disadvantageous backgrounds, sometimes we push them into the system ill-prepared, and we haven't gotten the result that we expected because we have very, very, very high dropout rates. What is the graduation rate of Pell Grant recipients in the United States within not 4 years, not 5 years, in 6 years? Ask Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, and he will tell you, I don't know. That in itself is a scandal. We spend $40 billion a year on this. We don't even know what the graduation rate is. So I wrote a piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education 6 months ago. I said, well, what the hell? I said, the Pell Grant graduation rate is 40%. I ran a regression equation. I took some data, the inferential data, and came up with an estimate. actually came out a little less than 40. I said, I'll give the benefit of the doubt and round up to 40. No one has challenged that. Now that means for every 5 people receiving Pell Grants, 2 get degrees, 3 don't. Now, that is a cost to society. And so these grant programs have often had unintended effects on low-income people because they end up with $20,000, $30,000 debts, student debts to pay, and they don't have a great degree. They're working at Walmart or Lowe's. $8 an hour and $20,000, and they don't even have a degree. So what do we do about that? So I didn't mean to. I loved your question. I loved your question. I'd adopt you if you need a parent. But yes.
My question, if I could answer this a little quickly, would be how do we transition without, that's always my fear.
How do you go from A to B?
Right.
I don't know. I simply don't know. I do think, there are things I would like to see, for example, I'd like to see the federal government get out of the loan business. Totally. Leave it. Goodbye. They could do it in ways that would be you do it over a 3-5 year period, you don't do it overnight. You don't yank loans away from students in the middle of a semester or something. That would not be appropriate. And I would have the government perhaps provide a voucher type aid for low income students as a stopgap to help the truly poor maintain their ability to go to school, but move away from the system that we have now, which has been so unsuccessful in helping achieve its one goal, which is access, and probably its major goal, greater access to higher ed. And I also think it has lowered quality. I think it's led to great inflation. I could go on and on and on with a whole bunch of other things it's done. So I think you can do some things like voucherize, move sort of in steps in that direction towards a different system. Some of you know I'm not the only one in this room, but I'm at the upper end of the age distribution in this room. And those of us who went to school in the 50s and 60s, we had scholarship programs and so forth for poor students in those days. This is not a new idea. But I think on the whole, the system worked a little bit better in those days. It certainly worked more cheaply. Whether the overall quality of education is higher or not, is a debatable proposition. But there's a lot. Have you read Academically Adrift? I mean, look at the literature. Academically Adrift is not a perfect book. Published by the Social Science Research Council, a very fine book. It argues that the critical learning thinking skills of seniors in most American schools is no greater than it is, just marginally greater than it is for freshmen. Well, isn't really on cost-benefit grounds worth our society putting these resources into that? When we get 45% dropout rates, we get 45% dropout rates. If a school gives lots of Pell Grants out to kids who want to come in, and then everyone drops out, does the school pay a penny? Does it have any disincentives for doing what it does? No. Maybe they should have some skin in the game. This is one thing I do. Make the schools have some skin in the game. If they start having miserable graduation rates and performance rates amongst the students, and they had to sort of pay for this, then maybe they would change their ways. Now, the way they change their ways may be, we'll just make every professor give everyone a C or above. Well, we can handle the problem in an illegitimate way, which is to lower standards, so it's not an easy matter to deal with, but there are ways it can be dealt with. So, American universities are alleged to be the best in the world. There's the index in Shanghai. There's a Shanghai index that shows this. There's an index in London. The top 100 schools, I think last I looked, 58 were American. 58 out of 100. Case is probably on the list. And pretty darn good. But that's based on our research. No one doubts that we're a great research center. But how are we on the rest of what we do? I don't know. Thank you very much.